A military wife having an affair discovers her lover is actually an undercover investigator hired by her deployed husband, but the investigator has fallen genuinely in love with her and must choose between duty and heart. The photographs scattered across the coffee table like fallen leaves told a story Meredith never wanted to read. Each image captured moments she thought were private: stolen kisses in the park, intimate dinners by candlelight, her hand intertwined with fingers that weren't her husband's. "You hired him," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her own heartbeat. The words hung in the air between her and the man she'd called her lover for 3 months, the man whose real name she was only now learning. "Blake, tell me you didn't know." Blake's silence was answer enough. The revelation crashed over her like a tsunami, washing away everything she thought she understood about love, trust, and the price of loneliness. 3 months earlier, when Staff Sergeant Connor Reeves had deployed to Afghanistan for his second tour, Meredith had promised herself she wouldn't become one of those wives, the ones who crumbled under the weight of separation, who sought comfort in the arms of strangers. But promises, she'd learned, were fragile things, easily broken by the relentless ache of an empty bed and the suffocating silence of a house that echoed with memories instead of laughter. The night she'd met Blake at the coffee shop downtown, she'd been running from that silence. Her wedding ring had felt heavy on her finger as she'd ordered her usual, a vanilla latte with an extra shot, the kind of indulgence Connor always teased her about. The barista had been new, fumbling with the espresso machine, and the delay had stretched long enough for her to notice the man at the corner table. Dark hair, gentle eyes, a smile that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade of military wife strength. "Rough day?" he'd asked when she'd finally claimed her drink, steam rising between them like a question mark. She should have walked away. Should have mumbled something polite and hurried home to her empty house and another night of counting days until Connor's return. Instead, she'd found herself sliding into the seat across from him, her wedding ring suddenly feeling like a brand against her skin. "You could say that," she'd replied, and with those 4 words, she'd stepped onto a path that would lead her here, to this moment of devastating truth. Blake had been everything Connor wasn't. Where her husband was all sharp angles and military precision, Blake was soft curves and easy laughter. Where Connor communicated in clipped sentences and tactical briefings during their weekly video calls, Blake listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Where Connor's love felt like duty performed with dedication, Blake's felt like a choice made fresh each day.
Or so she believed.
Now, staring at the evidence of her betrayal spread across her own coffee table like a crime scene, Meredith wondered if anything about the past 3 months had been real. The way Blake had seemed to appear exactly when she needed him most. The uncanny timing of their encounters. The fact that he'd never pressed for details about her marriage, never asked the probing questions most men in his position might have asked. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "About Connor hiring you, I mean." Blake, whose real name, she'd learned from the investigator's report lying open beside the photographs, was Blake Morrison, licensed private investigator, specializing in infidelity cases, ran his hands through his hair. The gesture was achingly familiar, one she'd grown to love during their stolen afternoons together. Now it felt like another lie, another performance in a 3-month charade. "From the beginning," he admitted, and the words hit her like physical blows. "Connor hired me 6 weeks into his deployment. Said he had a feeling something was off with your phone calls, that you seemed distant. He wanted to know if his suspicions were founded." The irony was sharp enough to cut. Connor's instincts had been right, but for all the wrong reasons. At 6 weeks into his deployment, Meredith had still been the faithful wife he'd married 4 years ago. She hadn't met Blake yet, hadn't even considered the possibility of an affair. Connor's suspicions had been born from paranoia, not evidence, the kind of toxic doubt that military marriages often struggled against like a persistent infection. "So, you decided to create the very thing he was looking for?" The accusation hung between them, heavy with hurt and confusion. Blake's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flash of the man she'd fallen in love with, or thought she had. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Meredith. I was supposed to watch you, document your activities, prove to Connor that his fears were unfounded. The affair, that was never part of the plan. But it became part of the plan pretty quickly, didn't it? She gestured to the photographs, each one a testament to moments that had felt sacred at the time. You certainly documented everything thoroughly. The photographs told the story of their relationship in painful detail. There was the first time he'd touched her hand across the table at the coffee shop, her wedding ring clearly visible in the frame. The afternoon they'd walked through Riverside Park, her head tilted toward his as he whispered something that had made her laugh. The evening they'd shared their first kiss in the parking lot behind the Italian restaurant on 5th Street, the same restaurant where Connor had proposed 3 years earlier. Each image was time-stamped, dated, cataloged with the professional precision of a man who made his living exposing other people's secrets. But as Meredith studied them more closely, she began to notice something that made her breath catch in her throat. In the later photographs, the ones taken in the past month, Blake's attention wasn't on the camera. His focus was entirely on her, his expression soft with something that looked remarkably like genuine affection. These weren't all taken by you, she realized, picking up a photograph from their second date. Someone else was there, watching us. Blake nodded, his jaw tight with what might have been shame or anger. She couldn't tell which. Connor wanted a full record. He hired a second investigator to document my interactions with you, to ensure I was being thorough and professional. The layers of deception were staggering. Her husband had hired one man to watch her, then hired another to watch the first man watching her. It was a Russian doll of mistrust and manipulation that made her feel dizzy with the scope of it. So every moment we shared, she said slowly, every conversation, every kiss, every time I told you I was falling in love with you, all of it was being recorded for my husband's benefit. Not all of it. Blake's voice was barely above a whisper. The past month. Meredith, I stopped taking the photos 5 weeks ago. I stopped filing the reports. I told Connor's contact that you were clean, that there was nothing to worry about. She looked up at him sharply. But these photos were taken by the second investigator, the one Connor hired to watch me. Blake's admission hung in the air like smoke. I didn't know about him until yesterday. That's when I got the call from Connor's lawyer, telling me to prepare my final report because Connor was coming home early. Apparently, the second investigator had been feeding him information all along. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Connor was coming home. Not in 3 months as planned, but soon. And he was armed with evidence of her betrayal, evidence that painted her as exactly the kind of unfaithful military wife she'd sworn she'd never become. When, she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Tomorrow night. His flight lands at 8:47 p.m. 24 hours. She had 24 hours to figure out how to face the man she'd married, the man she'd promised to honor and cherish, the man she betrayed with his own hired investigator. The situation would be laughable if it wasn't so devastating. What are you going to tell him? She asked. In your report, I mean. Blake was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. I don't know. It was the first completely honest thing he'd said to her in 3 months, and perversely, it was the moment she felt closest to him. Not during their passionate kisses or whispered confessions of love, but in this moment of shared uncertainty and fear. Did any of it mean anything to you? The question escaped before she could stop it, vulnerable and raw in the space between them. Or was I just another assignment that got complicated? Blake reached for her hand, then stopped himself, his fingers hovering inches from hers. Everything changed the night you told me about your father.
She remembered that night.
They'd been walking along the riverfront, the city lights reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. She'd been talking about her childhood, about the father who'd left when she was 12, about the pattern of abandonment that had made her wary of love until she'd met Connor. Blake had listened with the kind of attention that felt like sanctuary, and when she'd started to cry, he'd held her without judgment, without trying to fix or solve or explain away her pain. That's when I knew I was in trouble, he continued. When I realized that what I felt for you had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with who you are. The way you laugh when you're surprised by something funny. The way you always order extra whipped cream and then act embarrassed about it. The way you talk about your students, you light up when you talk about teaching those kids. Each detail was a small knife twist of truth. He'd been paying attention, really paying attention, in ways that went beyond professional obligation. But was it enough to forgive the foundation of lies their relationship was built on? I fell in love with you, Meredith, Blake said, and the words carried the weight of confession. Not the assignment, not the job, not the target.
You.
And I know that doesn't excuse what I did, how I deceived you, but I need you to know that what happened between us, at least from my side, was real. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired, especially when the break was this complete, this devastating. So where does that leave us? She asked. Connor comes home tomorrow night with evidence of our affair. You have to file a report that will probably destroy my marriage. And somehow, in the middle of all this deception and betrayal, you're telling me you love me? I'm telling you I love you, Blake confirmed, and I'm asking you to run away with me. The words hung in the air between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric with possibility. Run away. Leave everything behind. Her home, her job, her life, the marriage that had been crumbling long before Blake arrived to document its destruction. Start over somewhere new, with someone who claimed to love her enough to abandon his own life for the chance at a future together. It was the stuff of romance novels and Hollywood endings, the kind of dramatic gesture that was supposed to sweep her off her feet and make everything else fade away. Instead, it made her angry. Run away, she repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. Blake, you lied to me for 3 months. You made me fall in love with you while you were being paid to destroy my marriage. And now you want me to just, what? Trust you? Leave everything behind and start over with someone who's proven he's capable of that level of deception. I know how it sounds, Blake said, standing and beginning to pace the length of her living room. I know it seems crazy, and I know I have no right to ask you for anything after what I've done. But Meredith, what we have is real. Whatever else was fake, whatever else was a lie, what we feel for each other is real. Is it? She challenged. How can I trust anything you say? How can I trust my own feelings when they were manipulated from the very beginning? The question struck at the heart of her confusion. She'd fallen in love with Blake, but she'd fallen in love with a version of him that was partly performance, partly professional manipulation. How much of what she felt was genuine attraction, and how much was the result of his carefully orchestrated seduction? Blake stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression desperate. Because you know me, Meredith.
The real me.
Not the investigator, not the man Connor hired, but the person I am when I'm with you. The man who brings you coffee exactly the way you like it. The one who remembers that you hate romantic comedies, but love action movies with strong female leads. The one who knows you're afraid of thunderstorms, but won't admit it to anyone else. Each detail was accurate, each observation proof that he'd been paying attention to more than just her potential infidelity. But it was also proof of how thoroughly he'd infiltrated her life, how completely he'd learned to read her. You studied me, she said, the realization cold and bitter. All of those things, they're just data points in your investigation. Some of them, maybe, Blake admitted. At first. But Meredith, there's no way to fake the way I feel when you smile at me. There's no professional training that teaches you how to manufacture the way my heart races when you laugh. What started as an assignment became the most real thing in my life. The confession was raw with honesty, but it didn't change the fundamental problem. Their entire relationship was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Could love really grow from such toxic soil? And even if it could, was it worth the devastation it would leave in its wake? What about Connor? She asked. He's still my husband. He's still the man I made vows to. The man who's been serving our country while I've been here betraying him with his own hired investigator. The guilt was a constant ache in her chest, made worse by the knowledge that Connor's suspicions had been self-fulfilling prophecy. If he'd trusted her, If he'd communicated his fears instead of hiring investigators, would any of this have happened? Or had their marriage been doomed from the moment he'd decided surveillance was preferable to conversation? Your marriage was already in trouble, Blake said gently. That's why he hired me in the first place. Connor knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. So, you gave him something to be right about? I gave him the truth. Maybe not the truth he was looking for, but the truth nonetheless. Meredith, you weren't happy. You were lonely and isolated and slowly disappearing into the role of perfect military wife. I saw it the first night I met you. You were drowning, and no one was throwing you a lifeline. His words hit too close to home, exposing truths she'd been trying to avoid. Her marriage to Connor had been struggling long before his deployment, strained by the demands of military life and the growing distance between two people who'd forgotten how to talk to each other about anything deeper than logistics and schedules. That doesn't excuse what we did, she said, but the fight was going out of her voice. It doesn't excuse what you did. No, Blake agreed. It doesn't, but it explains it. And maybe if we're honest about what led us here, we can figure out where to go next. Where to go next? The question loomed before her like a mountain she had to climb, each potential path fraught with consequences and complications. She could confess everything to Connor when he returned, throw herself on his mercy, and hope their marriage could survive the betrayal. She could continue the affair in secret, living a double life that would eventually destroy her from the inside out. Or she could take Blake's hand and leap into the unknown, burning every bridge behind her for the chance at something that might be love, or might be the most expensive mistake of her life. I need time to think, she said finally. Blake nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. How much time? I don't know. Connor's plane lands tomorrow night. I suppose I have until then to figure out what I'm going to tell him. And what you're going to tell me? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Blake was asking for more than time. He was asking for hope, for some indication that his confession of love and dramatic proposal hadn't fallen on completely deaf ears. I don't know that either, she admitted. Blake gathered the photographs from the coffee table, sliding them back into the manila envelope they'd spilled from. The gesture felt final, like the closing of a book she wasn't sure she was ready to finish reading. For what it's worth, he said, pausing at her front door, I'm sorry. For the deception, for the lies, for putting you in this impossible position. But I'm not sorry for falling in love with you. I'll never be sorry for that. After he left, Meredith sat in her living room surrounded by the silence that had driven her into Blake's arms in the first place. But now, instead of feeling empty, the silence felt full of possibility and terror in equal measure. 24 hours to decide the rest of her life. 24 hours to choose between the familiar pain of a failing marriage and the terrifying unknown of a love born from deception. She picked up her phone to call her sister, then put it down again. This wasn't the kind of decision that could be made with advice from well-meaning family members. This was the kind of choice that had to come from somewhere deeper, from the part of herself she'd been trying to rediscover long before Blake Morrison walked into her life. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather was reflecting her mood. Meredith called in sick to the elementary school where she taught third grade, something she'd done only twice in her 4-year career. She spent the day walking through the city, trying to untangle the knot of emotions and obligations that had become her life. She found herself at the coffee shop where she'd first met Blake, sitting at the same corner table where he'd asked her about her rough day. The barista was different, older, more experienced, and Meredith's latte arrived quickly and without conversation. She wondered if that was a sign of some kind, if the universe was trying to tell her something about the role of chance versus choice in the direction of a life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Connor. Flight delayed. Won't be home until after midnight.
Can't wait to see you.
The message was signed with a heart emoji, a small gesture that pierced her with its simple sweetness. Connor wasn't a perfect husband, but he wasn't a villain either. He was a man who loved his country and his wife, even if he'd forgotten how to show the latter in ways that mattered. His decision to hire an investigator had been born from insecurity and poor communication, not malice. Did that make his betrayal of trust any less damaging than hers? At 6 o'clock, as the evening light began to fade, Meredith's phone rang. Blake's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered on the fourth ring. "Hi," she said, the word carrying more weight than any single syllable should bear. "Hi," Blake replied. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better." She paused, watching pedestrians hurry past the coffee shop window, each one carrying their own secrets and complications. "Connor's flight is delayed. He won't be home until after midnight. That gives us more time." "Does it? Time for what, Blake?" "Time for you to convince me to run away with you? Time for me to figure out how to forgive you for 3 months of lies? Time for me to decide whether what I feel for you is real or just the result of expert manipulation." Blake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft with understanding. "Time for you to decide what you want your life to look like tomorrow morning." The simple statement cut through all the complexity and confusion, reducing her choice to its essential elements. Tomorrow morning, she would wake up as either Connor's wife or Blake's lover or something else entirely, a woman who'd chosen herself over either of the men who claimed to love her. "I keep thinking about that first night," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "At the coffee shop. You asked me if I was having a rough day, and I said yes. But Blake, I'd been having a rough year. A rough marriage. A rough life, if I'm being honest. And you made me feel like myself again. Like I mattered." "You do matter," Blake said immediately. "You matter more than you know." But was it real? That feeling, that connection, was any of it real, or was I just responding to professional-grade emotional manipulation? The question had been haunting her since their confrontation the day before. If Blake was skilled enough to manufacture a connection convincing enough to fool her for 3 months, how could she trust her own emotions? How could she trust anything about the situation? "Meredith," Blake said, and she heard something in his voice she'd never heard before, vulnerability mixed with absolute certainty. "I wanted to think about the night we went to see that terrible action movie at the drive-in theater. Do you remember what happened?" She remembered. They'd been together for about 6 weeks, and Blake had suggested the drive-in as a nostalgic throwback to teenage dates. The movie had been predictably awful, full of explosions and one-dimensional characters, but they'd laughed through most of it, making sarcastic commentary and sharing overpriced popcorn. "You fell asleep," she said, the memory surprisingly clear and warm despite everything that had happened since. "I fell asleep," Blake confirmed. "During the climactic battle scene, with explosions going off every 30 seconds, I fell asleep with my head on your shoulder. Do you know why?" Meredith felt her throat tighten with emotion she wasn't prepared for. "Tell me." "Because for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely safe. Not professionally competent, not in control, not strategically positioned, safe. The kind of safe you can only feel when you're with someone who sees all your flaws and chooses to love you anyway." The confession hit her like a physical blow, partly because it was exactly how she'd felt in that moment. Watching Blake sleep, his face relaxed and peaceful in the flickering light from the drive-in screen, she'd felt a tenderness so profound it had scared her. It was the moment she'd known she was falling in love, and she'd spent the rest of the movie memorizing his features, storing up the feeling of his weight against her shoulder like a treasure she could carry with her through the lonely nights ahead. "That wasn't performance," Blake continued. "That wasn't part of the job. That was me, exhausted by the effort of lying to you, finally allowing myself to be vulnerable with the woman I was falling in love with." "But you were still lying to me," Meredith said, though the words came out weaker than she'd intended. "Even in that moment, even when you felt safe, you were still living a lie." "Yes," Blake admitted. "I was. But Meredith, the way I felt about you, that was never a lie. The job brought me to you, but what happened after that first conversation had nothing to do with Connor or the investigation or anything except the fact that you're extraordinary." Extraordinary. The word hung between them, a gift she wasn't sure she deserved or could accept. She'd never felt extraordinary in her marriage to Connor, had never felt like anything more than a supporting character in his military career. With Blake, she'd felt seen, valued, treasured. But had that feeling been genuine, or had it been the product of expert emotional manipulation designed to make her vulnerable to seduction? "I don't know how to trust you," she said, the admission raw with pain. "I don't know how to trust myself. Everything I thought I knew about the past 3 months has been turned upside down." "Then don't trust me," Blake said, his words surprising her. "Don't trust your feelings for me. Don't trust anything about our relationship." "But Meredith, trust this. You deserve better than what you have. You deserve a partner who sees your worth, who communicates with you instead of spying on you, who chooses to build something with you instead of tearing it down with suspicion and doubt." The words hit home because they articulated something she'd been feeling but hadn't been able to express. Her marriage to Connor had been slowly suffocating her, not through any dramatic betrayal or abuse, but through the gradual erosion of connection and communication. She'd been disappearing into the role of military wife, losing herself in the demands of supporting his career and maintaining their household, until she'd become a ghost of the woman he'd originally fallen in love with. "That still doesn't justify what we did," she said, but the protest felt automatic, a reflex rather than a conviction. "No," Blake agreed. "It doesn't, but it explains why it happened. And maybe, if we're honest about that, we can figure out how to move forward in a way that honors everyone involved, including ourselves." Meredith looked at her watch. It was nearly 7 o'clock, and Connor's delayed flight would be landing in less than 6 hours. 6 hours to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. "Blake," she said slowly, "if I asked you to walk away from me, from the investigation, from everything, would you do it?" The question surprised her even as she asked it. She hadn't known she was going to say it until the words were already out of her mouth, but suddenly it felt like the most important thing in the world to know his answer. "Is that what you want?" Blake asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I don't know. Maybe. I think I need to know that you would, that you're capable of putting my well-being ahead of your own desires." Blake was quiet for a long moment, and Meredith could hear the city traffic in the background, the ordinary sounds of life continuing around them while her world hung in the balance. "Yes," he said finally. "If that's what you need, if that's what would be best for you, then yes. I would walk away. I would disappear from your life completely, file a report that clears you of any wrongdoing, and never contact you again." The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but instead, it filled her with a panic she hadn't expected. The thought of Blake disappearing from her life completely, of never seeing him again, of returning to the suffocating loneliness that had driven her into his arms in the first place, it was unbearable. "But I don't want you to," she said, the words coming out in a rush of honesty that surprised them both. "Blake, I don't want you to disappear. I'm angry and hurt and confused, but I don't want to lose you." "Then what do you want?" It was the question she'd been avoiding, the one that required her to stop analyzing and start feeling, to stop protecting herself and start taking risks. "I want to believe you," she said. "I want to believe that what we have is real, that it's worth the destruction it's going to cause, that love can grow from such a damaged foundation. And I want to believe that I'm brave enough to choose happiness over security, love over duty, the unknown over the familiar." "Are you?" The question hung in the air between them, and Meredith realized that Blake wasn't going to make this decision for her. He wasn't going to sweep her off her feet with grand gestures or manipulate her with professional techniques. He was asking her to choose, freely and fully, with complete knowledge of the consequences. "I think so," she said, and the words felt like a prayer, a hope, a leap of faith into something that might be love or might be the biggest mistake of her life. "What does that mean, Meredith? What are you choosing?" She closed her eyes and thought about Connor, the man she'd married with such hope and optimism 4 years ago. She thought about the promises they'd made to each other, the life they'd tried to build, the slow erosion of connection that had led them to this moment. She thought about the investigation he'd commissioned, the lack of trust it represented, the fundamental breakdown in communication that had made surveillance seem preferable to conversation. Then she thought about Blake, the man who'd entered her life as a lie, but who claimed to have found truth in their connection. She thought about the way he listened, really listened, when she talked about her dreams and fears. She thought about the way he made her laugh, the way he saw her as a complete person rather than just a supporting character in someone else's story. "It means," she said slowly, "that I'm not going to be home when Connor's plane lands tonight." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for what felt like eternity, and Meredith wondered if she'd finally said something that had shocked Blake into speechlessness. "Are you sure?" he asked finally, his voice tight with emotion. "No," she admitted. "I'm not sure about anything. But I'm sure that I can't go back to the way things were. I can't pretend the past 3 months didn't happen. Can't pretend I didn't fall in love with you. Can't pretend that my marriage was working before you came along to complicate it." "Where will you go?" It was a practical question, the kind of detail that needed to be worked out if she was really going to do this crazy, impulsive, potentially life-destroying thing. "I don't know," she said, and the admission was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. "Maybe to my sisters in Portland. Maybe somewhere completely new. Maybe it doesn't matter, as long as I'm making the choice for myself instead of letting other people make it for me." "Meredith," Blake said, and his voice was soft with something that might have been awe. "Are you asking me to come with you?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Was she asking him to come with her? Was she ready to build a life with a man who'd proven himself capable of elaborate deception, even if that deception had led to genuine love? "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe not right away. Maybe I need time to figure out who I am when I'm not someone's wife or someone's target. But Blake, I'm not ready to say goodbye to you either." "Then we'll figure it out," Blake said, and for the first time since this conversation began, she heard hope in his voice. "Whatever you need, however long it takes, we'll figure out together. What about your report? What are you going to tell Connor?" Blake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady with resolve. "I'm going to tell him the truth. That I was hired to investigate his wife's potential infidelity, that I found evidence of an affair, and that the subject has disappeared, location unknown." "That's not the whole truth." "No," Blake agreed. "But it's all the truth he needs to know. The rest, what happened between us, why it happened, what it means, that's our story, not his." Meredith felt tears prick at her eyes, though she couldn't tell if they were from relief or grief or something else entirely. She was about to destroy her marriage, abandon her home, disappoint everyone who'd believed in her as the perfect military wife. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was making a choice that was truly her own. "I need to pack," she said. "I need to figure out how to disappear without a trace, at least for a while." "I can help with that," Blake said. Professional expertise, remember? The offer should have made her angry, another reminder of the deception that had brought them together. Instead, it made her laugh, a sound that surprised them both with its genuine joy. "This is crazy," she said. "This is absolutely insane." "The best things usually are," Blake replied. Meredith ended the call and sat in the coffee shop for a few more minutes, watching the ordinary world continue around her while her own life underwent a complete transformation. Then she stood up, walked out into the drizzling evening, and went home to pack for a future she couldn't imagine but was finally brave enough to choose. 2 hours later, her suitcases were in the back of her car, her wedding ring was on the kitchen counter next to a letter that tried to explain the unexplainable, and she was driving toward a highway that would take her anywhere but here. Her phone buzzed with a text from Blake. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that loving you was the most real thing I've ever done." She didn't text back. Couldn't, while she was driving toward an uncertain future with tears streaming down her face. But she smiled, an expression full of pain and hope and the terrible, wonderful freedom of choosing love over safety, truth over convenience, herself over everyone else's expectations. Behind her, Connor's plane was beginning its descent into a city that no longer contained the wife he thought he knew. Ahead of her, the highway stretched into darkness, full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. And somewhere between the past she was leaving and the future she was driving toward, Meredith Reed finally understood that sometimes the most devastating betrayals were also the most liberating truths, and that love, real love, was worth almost any price, even when it was born from the ashes of deception. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was hers to choose. 3 months later, Connor would receive a postcard from a small coastal town in Oregon. No return address, no signature, just a picture of a lighthouse standing sentinel against a stormy sea and 5 words written in familiar handwriting. I hope you find peace. He would never know that the woman who sent it had found something she'd never expected to discover, herself, complicated and flawed and finally, beautifully free. And somewhere in that same coastal town, in a small apartment overlooking the ocean, a former private investigator and a former military wife would be learning to build something new from the rubble of their respective deceptions, proving that sometimes the most unlikely foundations could support the most extraordinary love stories. But that, perhaps, is a story for another day. The Weight of Truth, a sequel. The sound of Connor's key turning in the lock at 1:17 a.m. should have been the beginning of a reunion. Instead, it was the first note in a symphony of devastation that would echo through 3 lives for months to come. Meredith. His voice carried the exhaustion of 36 hours of travel and the anticipation of holding his wife after 4 months of separation. The silence that answered him was wrong. Too complete, too final. Connor Reeves had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan by trusting his instincts, and those same instincts were screaming warnings as he moved through the darkened house. Her car was gone. Her keys weren't on the hook by the door. The absence felt deliberate, staged, like the calm before an ambush. He found the letter on the kitchen counter, propped against the coffee maker like a white flag of surrender. Next to it, her wedding ring caught the streetlight filtering through the window, a small circle of gold that had once promised forever. Connor's hands were steady as he opened the envelope, for years of military training had taught him to function even when his world was collapsing, but the words on the page hit him with the force of an IED. Connor, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know about Blake Morrison. I know about the investigation. I know that your suspicions were both wrong and right in ways that will probably destroy us both. I won't be coming back. I'm sorry for what I've done, and I'm sorry for what you drove me to do. We both deserve better than what we became. The letter was brief, clinical in its precision, and it told him nothing he needed to know while confirming everything he'd feared. His wife, his Meredith, who used to leave him rambling voicemails about her students' latest achievements, who sent care packages filled with his favorite candy and handwritten notes, had reduced the end of their marriage to 4 sentences and a signature. Connor read the letter 3 times before the words began to penetrate the shock. Blake Morrison, the investigator he'd hired to prove his wife's fidelity, had instead documented her infidelity, but not in the way Connor had expected. Somewhere in the professional distance of surveillance and documentation, Morrison had become personally involved. The hunter had become the prey, and Meredith had become the prize they'd both lost. His phone rang at 2:43 a.m. The caller ID showed Morrison's number, and Connor almost didn't answer. What was there to say? What conversation could possibly explain the betrayal that had unfolded in his absence? She's gone, Connor said without preamble. I know. Blake's voice was rough, with something that might have been grief or guilt. Connor, I need to tell you. Tell me what? That you fell in love with my wife while I was paying you to watch her? That you seduced her as part of your investigation? Or was the investigation just an excuse to get close to her? The questions came out like machine gun fire, each one designed to wound, to extract some kind of payment for the devastation Blake had helped create. But even as Connor spoke, he knew the answers wouldn't change anything. Meredith was gone. Their marriage was over, and no amount of anger or recrimination would bring back the life he'd thought he was fighting to protect. Both, Blake said quietly. Neither. Connor, it's more complicated than... Don't. Connor's voice cut through the explanation like a blade. Don't you dare tell me it's complicated. You were hired to do a job. You did it. The job is done. The job was to determine if your wife was having an affair. The answer is yes. But Connor, the affair happened because... Because what? Because I was deployed? Because I was serving my country while you were here seducing my wife. Blake was quiet for so long that Connor thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Connor had heard before, in the voices of soldiers who'd seen too much, done too much, Lost too much. Because she was lonely, Blake said. Because she'd been disappearing for months before I ever met her. Because your marriage was already broken, and I was just the symptom, not the disease. The accusation hit Connor like a physical blow, partly because it contained enough truth to cut deep. He'd known something was wrong in the months before his deployment. Their conversations had become stilted, perfunctory. Meredith had seemed distant, distracted, like she was performing the role of military wife rather than living it. But instead of talking to her, instead of trying to understand what was happening between them, he deployed with his suspicions intact and hired a stranger to do the emotional work he'd been too afraid to do himself. So this is my fault, Connor asked, and the words tasted like ashes. This is everyone's fault, Blake replied. Yours, mine, hers. We all made choices that led us here. But Connor, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the deception. I'm sorry for the pain. And I'm sorry that a marriage ended because 3 people were too scared to tell the truth when it mattered. Connor ended the call without responding. What was there to say? Blake Morrison had apologized for destroying his marriage, but apologies were inadequate currency for the kind of debt that had been created. Some betrayals were too large for forgiveness, some wounds too deep for healing. Over the following weeks, Connor threw himself into the administrative aspects of his personal catastrophe with the same methodical precision he'd brought to military operations. He filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and abandonment. He changed the locks on the house, canceled joint credit cards, and removed Meredith's name from bank accounts with the efficiency of someone dismantling an enemy position. But late at night, when the administrative tasks were complete and the house was quiet, Connor found himself staring at the ceiling and wondering where it had all gone wrong. Had he been so focused on protecting his marriage from external threats that he'd failed to notice the internal damage accumulating like stress fractures in a bridge? Had his suspicions been justified intuition or paranoid projection of his own fears and insecurities? The questions were unanswerable, but they tormented him nonetheless. He'd been trained to analyze threats, to identify weaknesses, to develop strategies for protection and response. But no amount of military training had prepared him for the possibility that the greatest threat to his marriage would come from his own decision to investigate it. 300 miles away, in a small coastal town where the Pacific Ocean crashed against rocky cliffs with relentless determination, Meredith was learning to live with the weight of her choices. The apartment she'd rented was small and sparse, furnished with a kind of generic pieces that suggested temporary occupancy rather than permanent residence. She'd found work as a substitute teacher at the local elementary school, a position that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but offered the anonymity she craved. Her days followed a careful routine designed to keep the guilt and uncertainty at bay. She woke early, walked along the beach as the sun rose over the water, taught classes with a kind of focused intensity that left no room for introspection, and spent her evenings reading novels that transported her to other people's problems and other people's lives. Blake called every few days, careful conversations that danced around the larger questions neither of them was ready to address. Where was their relationship going? Could love built on such a damaged foundation ever be trusted? Were they criminals who'd found each other or victims of circumstances beyond their control? I saw Connor last week, Blake said during one of their evening calls. It had been 6 weeks since Meredith had left, and Blake's updates on her former life had become a lifeline she wasn't sure she wanted but couldn't seem to give up. How did he look? The question escaped before she could stop it, revealing more about her emotional state than she'd intended. Like a man who's been through a war, Blake said carefully. Which, I suppose, he has been. Meredith closed her eyes and tried not to picture Connor's face, tried not to imagine the devastation she'd left in her wake. She told herself that leaving was kinder than staying, that a clean break was better than prolonged deception. But kindness was a luxury that belonged to people who hadn't betrayed their spouses, with hired investigators. What she'd done was expedient, not kind, a fact that haunted her during the long, sleepless hours when the ocean's rhythm wasn't enough to quiet her racing thoughts. Has he said anything? About me, I mean? Blake was quiet for a moment, and Meredith knew he was deciding how much truth she could handle. It was a consideration that would have infuriated her 6 weeks ago, another man deciding what she needed to know, what she could bear to hear. Now it felt like mercy. "He's angry," Blake said finally. "At both of us, but mostly at me. I think he blames me for creating a situation that didn't exist before I arrived." "But that's not true," Meredith said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "The situation did exist. The loneliness, the distance, the slow death of our marriage, all of that existed long before you knocked on my door with your fake story about being new in town. I know that. You know that. But Connor needs someone to blame, and I'm a more convenient target than the fundamental problems in your marriage that neither of you wanted to address." The analysis was clinical and probably accurate, but it didn't make Meredith feel any better about the destruction she'd left behind. Connor was a good man who'd made bad choices, just like she was a good woman who'd made bad choices. The difference was that her bad choices had ended their marriage, while his had merely exposed its existing fractures. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if we're just telling ourselves a story that makes us feel better about what we did? If maybe the truth is simpler and uglier than we want to admit?" "What kind of story?" "The story where we're star-crossed lovers whose connection transcended the deception that brought us together. The story where our love was so pure and true that it justified betraying a man who was serving his country. The story where we're the heroes of our own romance instead of the villains in someone else's tragedy." Blake was quiet for so long that Meredith wondered if she'd finally said something that had penetrated his careful optimism about their situation. "I think about that every day," he admitted. "I think about whether I'm a man who fell in love despite impossible circumstances, or a man who used those circumstances to justify taking something that didn't belong to me. And what conclusion do you reach? That maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the why matters less than the what happens next. We can spend the rest of our lives analyzing our motivations and assigning blame, or we can figure out how to build something honest from the wreckage we created." It was a pragmatic response, the kind of forward-thinking philosophy that probably served him well in his professional life. But Meredith wasn't sure she was ready to stop examining the wreckage, wasn't sure she was capable of building something new when she still didn't understand how the old thing had collapsed so completely. "Blake," she said, and her voice was soft with a vulnerability she'd been trying to protect. "What if we can't? What if the foundation is too damaged, the betrayal too complete? What if some things can't be repaired, only abandoned? Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Blake said. "But Meredith, I'm not ready to give up on us."
Not yet.
"Not when I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." The declaration should have been romantic, the kind of sweeping statement that belonged in movies and novels about complicated love affairs. Instead, it felt heavy with pressure and expectation, another burden to carry alongside the guilt and uncertainty that had become her constant companions. "I need more time," she said, and the words felt like a confession of weakness rather than a reasonable request. "You have all the time you need," Blake replied, but Meredith could hear the strain in his voice, the effort it took to be patient when patience felt like another form of abandonment. After they hung up, Meredith sat on her small balcony overlooking the ocean and tried to imagine a future that didn't feel like a punishment for past mistakes. The lighthouse beams swept across the water in regular intervals, a beacon of guidance for ships navigating treacherous waters. She wondered if she would ever find her own lighthouse, her own source of direction in the moral wilderness she'd created for herself. Back in the city they'd all once called home, Connor was discovering that divorce proceedings were like military operations, a series of strategic moves designed to achieve specific objectives while minimizing collateral damage. His lawyer was efficient and dispassionate, treating the dissolution of his marriage like a business transaction that required careful documentation and tactical precision. "We should discuss the house," Margaret Hoffman said during their third meeting. She was a family law attorney with 20 years of experience in military divorces, and she approached Connor's case with a kind of professional detachment that he found both comforting and disturbing. "What about it? Your wife hasn't responded to any of our communications. No forwarding address, no legal representation, no indication that she intends to contest the divorce or pursue her share of the marital assets." From a strategic standpoint, her absence simplifies things considerably. Connor stared out the conference room window at the city traffic flowing past like a river of ordinary life. Other people going about their normal business, other people whose marriages hadn't imploded during their absence, other people who didn't have to discuss the strategic advantages of spousal abandonment with attorneys who charged $300 an hour. She doesn't want anything, he said. The house, the savings, the furniture. She left it all behind. That may be her intention now, but intentions can change. I'd recommend we proceed, as if she might resurface at some point to claim her share of the assets. It's better to be prepared for that possibility than to be caught off guard. The conversation continued in the same vein, clinical discussions of property division, asset protection, and timeline management. Connor participated because he had to, because divorce was a legal process that required his attention and cooperation. But part of him remained detached from the proceedings, observing them with the same sense of unreality that had characterized his entire life since returning home to find Meredith's wedding ring on the kitchen counter. "There's one more thing we should discuss," Margaret said as their meeting was winding down. "The investigator you hired, Blake Morrison. Have you considered whether you want to pursue any kind of legal action against him?" Connor looked up sharply. What kind of legal action? Professional misconduct, breach of contract, possibly fraud depending on the specific terms of your agreement. He was hired to investigate your wife's potential infidelity, and instead he became personally involved with her. There might be grounds for a civil suit. The suggestion hung in the air between them like a challenge. Connor could pursue Blake Morrison through the courts, could drag him through depositions and discovery proceedings, could potentially recover some financial compensation for the professional betrayal that had contributed to the destruction of his marriage. It would be satisfying in the way that revenge was always satisfying, a concrete action that provided the illusion of justice in a situation where justice was impossible. "No," Connor said finally. "I don't want to pursue legal action against Morrison." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "May I ask why?" "You have legitimate grounds for a complaint, and it might send a message to other investigators about maintaining professional boundaries." "Because he's not the one who broke my marriage vows," Connor said, and the words felt like a revelation even as he spoke them. "He's not the one who promised to love, honor, and cherish until death do us part. He was hired to do a job, and he did it. The fact that he fell in love with my wife in the process, that's between him and his own conscience." It was the first time Connor had articulated that particular truth, and it surprised him with its clarity. Blake Morrison had behaved unprofessionally, had crossed boundaries that should have remained intact, had contributed to the destruction of Connor's marriage. But Morrison hadn't made the vows that mattered. Morrison hadn't been the one to promise fidelity and commitment and all the other things that Meredith had abandoned when she'd chosen to love someone else. Margaret made a note on her legal pad, but Connor could see the question in her expression. Why wasn't he angrier? Why wasn't he pursuing every available avenue for retribution and compensation? Why was he letting the man who'd seduced his wife walk away without consequences? The answer was complicated and painful and probably wouldn't make sense to anyone who hadn't lived through the slow death of a marriage from the inside. Connor was angry, furious, in fact, but his anger was directed at the right targets. Himself, for hiring an investigator instead of talking to his wife, Meredith, for choosing betrayal over communication, and the military lifestyle that had put impossible strain on a relationship that might have thrived under different circumstances. Blake Morrison was a symptom, not the disease. Pursuing him through the courts would be satisfying in the short term, but it wouldn't address the fundamental issues that had made their affair possible in the first place. "There is one thing I'd like you to do," Connor said as they gathered their papers. "I'd like you to have someone deliver a message to my wife. Nothing legal, nothing official. Just a personal message." "What kind of message?" Connor was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for feelings that were too large and complex for simple expression. "Tell her that I hope she's happy. Tell her that I forgive her, even if I can't understand her choices. And tell her that if she ever wants to talk, really talk, not through lawyers, she knows how to reach me." Margaret looked skeptical. "Mr. Reeves, I'm not sure that's advisable from a legal standpoint. Any direct communication with your wife could complicate the divorce proceedings." Then don't put it in writing. Just find a way to let her know. Please. It was the first favor Connor had asked of anyone since returning home to find his life in ruins, and Margaret must have heard something in his voice that convinced her to set aside her professional caution. I'll see what I can do, she said. The message reached Meredith 3 weeks later, delivered by a private investigator who tracked her down at the elementary school where she was teaching. The irony wasn't lost on her. Another investigator, another intrusion into her carefully constructed new life. But this one brought forgiveness instead of devastation, and that made all the difference. She read Connor's message sitting in her car in the school parking lot, surrounded by the ordinary chaos of children being picked up by parents who probably took their intact families for granted. The words were simple and generous and more painful than any accusation could have been. He forgives me, she thought, and the forgiveness felt heavier than anger would have been. Anger she could have deflected, justified, fought against. Forgiveness required her to sit with the full weight of what she'd done, to acknowledge the pain she'd caused without the protective barrier of righteous indignation. That evening, she called Blake with a clarity she hadn't felt since leaving her old life behind. Connor sent me a message, she said without preamble. What kind of message? The kind that makes me realize we need to stop hiding from the truth about what we did. Blake was quiet, waiting for her to continue. We destroyed a marriage, Blake. Maybe it was already damaged, maybe it was already failing, but we delivered the killing blow. And we did it not because we were swept away by irresistible passion, but because we were both too cowardly to deal with our problems honestly. Meredith. No, let me finish. You were too cowardly to walk away from an assignment that was compromising your professional ethics. I was too cowardly to tell my husband that I was lonely and scared and losing myself in our marriage. Instead of facing those truths, we created a fantasy where we were star-crossed lovers whose connection justified any betrayal. The words were harsh, but they felt true in a way that all their previous conversations about love and fate and impossible circumstances had not. Sometimes the truth was ugly and unheroic, and sometimes the most honest thing you could do was acknowledge your own capacity for selfishness and cowardice. So, where does that leave us? Blake asked, and his voice carried a weariness that matched her own. I don't know, Meredith admitted, but I think it leaves us with the obligation to be honest about what we are and what we've done. We're not tragic heroes or star-crossed lovers. We're two people who made selfish choices that hurt an innocent man, and now we have to figure out how to live with that. And can we? Live with it, I mean? It was the question that had been haunting her for months, the one she'd been too afraid to ask directly. Could love survive the acknowledgement of its own ugly origins? Could a relationship built on deception and betrayal ever become something honest and worthy? I don't know, she said again. But Blake, I'm tired of running from the truth. I'm tired of telling myself pretty stories about what we are. If we're going to have any chance of building something real, it has to start with complete honesty about what we've done and who we are. Even if that honesty destroys us? Especially if that honesty destroys us. Because if we can't survive the truth about ourselves, then we don't deserve to survive at all. It was a harsh philosophy, but it felt like the only path forward through the moral wilderness they'd created. They could continue living in the fantasy of their epic love story, or they could confront the ugly reality of their choices and see what, if anything, could be built from that foundation of truth. I love you, Blake said, and the words carried a weight they'd never had before. Not the easy declaration of infatuation, but the difficult commitment of someone choosing to love despite complete knowledge of the beloved's capacity for betrayal and self-deception. I love you too, Meredith replied. But Blake, I don't know if love is enough. I don't know if we can build a life together while carrying the weight of what we did to Connor, what we did to his trust, what we did to the idea of marriage as something sacred and protected. Then, what do you want to do? It was the question she'd been avoiding for months, the one that required her to stop analyzing and start deciding. What did she want to do with the rest of her life? How did she want to carry the weight of her choices? What kind of person did she want to be moving forward? I want to go back, she said, and the words surprised her even as she spoke them. Back to Connor? Back to face him. Back to have the conversation we should have had months ago, before investigators and affairs and all the lies that followed. Back to tell him the truth about why I was so lonely, why our marriage was failing, why I was vulnerable to someone like you in the first place. Blake was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was soft with understanding and something that might have been relief. And after that conversation, what then? I don't know. Maybe Connor and I can find a way to end our marriage honestly, with full acknowledgement of what we both contributed to its failure. Maybe we can forgive each other and ourselves and find some kind of peace. And us. The question hung between them, heavy with all the love and betrayal and impossible hope that had defined their relationship from the beginning. I don't know, Meredith said for the third time. But Blake, I think we need to find out who we are when we're not running from the truth. I think we need to discover whether what we feel for each other can survive in the daylight, with all the ugly facts exposed and acknowledged. That's terrifying. Yes, Meredith agreed. But it's also the only way forward that doesn't involve spending the rest of our lives living a lie. She could hear Blake breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel him wrestling with the implications of what she was proposing. It would be so much easier to continue their long-distance relationship, to build a life together in a small coastal town where no one knew their history, where they could reinvent themselves as people who deserved the love they'd found in each other's arms. But easy had never been the right path for either of them, and Meredith was finally ready to choose the hard road that led toward truth rather than the comfortable path that led toward continued self-deception. When? Blake asked.
Soon.
This weekend, maybe. I've been hiding long enough. Do you want me to come with you? The question revealed everything about where they stood. Blake's willingness to face Connor's anger and judgment, his commitment to supporting her through the most difficult conversation of her life, his readiness to stop hiding behind distance and anonymity. Yes, Meredith said, and the word felt like a leap of faith into an unknown future. But not as my lover or my protector or my excuse. As someone who's ready to tell the truth about what we did and why we did it and what we owe to the man we hurt. And after we tell the truth? After we tell the truth, we'll find out whether we're the kind of people who can build something honest from the wreckage of our dishonesty. We'll find out whether love is enough to carry the weight of betrayal, whether forgiveness is possible, whether redemption is something you can earn or just something you have to hope for. It wasn't the ending to their story that either of them had imagined, but it was the only ending that offered the possibility of something real and lasting and worthy of the pain they'd all endured. The road ahead would be difficult, probably painful, certainly uncertain. But for the first time since she'd driven away from her old life 3 months ago, Meredith felt like she was moving towards something rather than running away from it. And sometimes, she thought as she ended the call and began planning her return to the scene of her greatest mistake, moving toward the truth was the bravest thing you could do, even when you had no idea what that truth might cost you. The conversation that would take place the following weekend between a betrayed husband, an unfaithful wife, and the investigator who'd fallen in love with his assignment would be unlike anything any of them had experienced. It would be painful and honest and devastating and necessary. And from its ashes, they would all discover whether redemption was possible, whether forgiveness could coexist with consequences, and whether love could survive the full weight of truth. But that conversation, and its aftermath, is a story that belongs to all three of them, and perhaps to anyone who has ever wondered whether the worst mistakes of our lives can become the foundation for our greatest growth. Some endings are also beginnings. Some truths are worth the price they demand. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is stop running towards something better and start walking back towards something honest.